Norman P. Ledger arrived at precisely 8:43, which was to say he arrived at exactly the time his watch said he should, and slightly late in a way that had been negotiated with himself in a dream the night before. The Department of Catastrophes, where he worked in a low alcove of a low floor, occupied that particular stretch of bureaucracy that was both geographically and metaphysically tucked away. It sat behind a door with a plaque that said in door block capitals, Department of Catastrophes Scheduling and Oversight. Directly below, in a smaller, slightly apologetic font, a second line read, Please do not disturb unless you are a catastrophe or it involves us. The door itself had a sign that rotated daily between entrance and entrance. The lobby smelled faintly of institutional polish and something like the inside of a ledger. A clock above the reception elegantly announced the time in Roman numerals, which is to say it suggested seriousness while conceding it had no idea what it was doing. Norman liked the clock. It matched his own relationship with time, reverent, slightly uncertain, and usually punctilious. He straightened his tie with 2 fingers, clicked the tiny stapler in his jacket pocket 3 times his personal superstition. 1 click for arrival, 2 for calibration, 3 for courage, and checked his pockets for the things that mattered. A fountain pen with a hairline crack at the nib. His spectacles that preferred the lower ridge of his nose, and a folded poem in his wallet that he read only when the kettle had gone cold. On his desk waited his day's allotment of smallness forms, both current and curiously archaic. A to-do list that had been annotated in 3 different inks and 2 temperaments. A polite sticky note that said, in a handwriting Norman admired for its bluntness, start here. The department itself resembled an archaic library that had recently been converted into an administrative call center. Cabinets rose like limestone cliffs of paper, their brass handles dulled by the touch of generations of fingers that had once signed something and had found, to their astonishment, that the paper did not, in fact, produce enlightenment. Norman's routine was a ritual of micro-gestures. He brewed a thermos of coffee, a habit more about the necessity of motion than the beverage itself. Because this coffee was somewhere between acceptable and worryingly determined, and prepared his stationery as if marshalling a small battalion. He placed his tiny stapler on the upper left corner of his desk, where it caught the light like a miniature sentinel. He arranged sticky notes in the particular order of precaution: yellow for active, green for pending, blue for things he suspected were not strictly his job, but he had a sentimental attachment to. He wrote the morning's marginalia, always a tiny quip, an incised observation that would make some future self smile in the margin of the topmost form. His marginalia varied by mood, sometimes optimistic, sometimes merely syntactically amused, and occasionally unpublishably honest about the copier's inability to cooperate. His colleagues had established themselves as part of the environment, as essential as a radiator that hums with governmental resolve. Clara Motes sat at the desk beside his, a quick-syllabled woman with an alarming fondness for biscuit tins. She kept an emergency supply of digestive biscuits in a desk drawer that had a sign reading, for crisis, both metaphysical and tea-related. Gideon Furl, the department's systems analyst, lived next to the wall where the cables made small, private arguments. Gideon breathed in spreadsheets and exhaled log files. He wore the expression of someone who had once loved metaphor, and then realized it had no useful syntax. Sergeant Hall Brooks kept the corridors safe, not only by virtue of his badge and the echoes of his boots, but because he read poetry in short stanzas at lunch and kept his face like a shield for the smaller anxieties of the office. Above them all hovered Area Vost, their immediate supervisor, and the woman who made the floor plan of the department look like the face of a stern, punctual god. Aria's bun was, in truth, a kind of ritual architecture. It was perfect, neat, and had the quality of being unarguably efficient. She carried a red pen in a holster that made it resemble an instrument of liturgical correction. When she walked, she performed a careful geometry with her gait. When she spoke, she tended to issue policy memos as if they were prayers. Norman regarded Aria with a kind of respectful fear. That fear twined itself with admiration because he'd seen her once, years before, delay a minor regional calamity by precisely 14.5 minutes. And the story had become a kind of legend in the break room. The department's mandate, as it had been explained on Norman's first day via an introductory packet that had an agreeable number of footnotes, was to schedule, monitor, and provide oversight for world-ending events. The phrase world-ending had a legal definition, in case you were wondering, which showed remarkable administrative foresight. The department defined world-ending on a matrix that allowed a spectrum of endings from metaphoric to literal. The existence of a schedule was a curious sort of reassurance. If you could assign a time and an accountable signer to the end of things, then the end belonged to a ledger and thus to an accountant, and accounted for things tended to feel less like being lectured by fate and more like receiving a formal summons. On the morning in question, the department was at its usual pitch, solemn, slightly damp with regulatory intent, and inhabited by a kind of quotidian absurdity. Memo boards claimed updates in fonts that refused to be taken seriously. A machine in the corner printed out arrival logs in triplicate and then, inexplicably, ate 2 of the copies. The communal kettle in the tiny kitchen was perpetually tepid, a mechanical decision somewhere between frugality and an institutional fear of anything that might boil over. Norman, as part of his ritual, kept a small sachet of tea in his drawer labeled for emergencies only, which was a comforting phrase until you considered that their emergencies included things like alien petitions for citizenship and a very insistent rain of ledger pages. Conversation drifted by his desk the way fog might drift down a stairwell. Clara offered Norman a biscuit for moral fiber, she said, and he accepted with gratitude that tasted like gratitude and 2 sugars. Gideon tapped at a terminal and offered a running commentary on the corruption of time stamps, as if they were a kind of poetry that refused to rhyme. Hal recited a 3-line stanza about the way shoes can show a man's history, which Norman failed to incorporate into his own mental inventory of useful facts, but stored somewhere for later marginal use. They spoke of the small things because larger things were often formally scheduled. That morning, an innocuous bit of gossip circulated at the kettle. A footnote had been found in the back of an archival ledger. The footnote mentioned a 10-step checklist no one remembered, and an obsolete stamp that had last been used when paper had only recently acquired weight. Obsolete stamps have a way of staying obsolete, Gideon murmured, as if offering a diagnosis. Norman smiled politely and annotated the thought in the margin of his pile. Obsolescence is a bureaucracy's favorite costume. Aria swept past their desks with the kind of speed that suggested she had somewhere important to be, which, given the department, she probably did. She stopped at Norman's desk, her red pen poised. Norman felt his chest do the odd little lift of someone being measured on a tape he could not see. Ledger, she said, and Norman's name sounded like a label being placed in crisp ink. Your marginalia are exceptionally charming today. Careful about the tone of humor in Form PX9. Last time someone labeled the danger column mildly inconvenient, an entire coastal village scheduled a minor existential crisis because they felt insulted. Norman blinked. I will be more precise, Ms. Vost. Mildly inconvenient has been struck from my register. She tapped the page with the tip of her pen, leaving a small, decisive red mark that seemed at once both judicial and affectionate. Good. Also, she paused, scanning his desk with the impossible exactness of someone familiar with 1,000 forms. You should discard obsolete stamps. They breed. Norman made a face appropriate to someone who had not realized that stamps could reproduce. I will place it into the obsolete drawer immediately. The obsolete drawer was a drawer in the large filing cabinet labeled obsolete, do not engage. It was an official drawer, because a bureaucracy must give its anxieties a home. Norman kept his hand on his stapler as he opened it. Opening the drawer made the air smell like paper and apology. Inside were things that Time had decided were no longer fashionable in catastrophe management. Pamphlets on how to pacify minor meteors, instructions for emergency debates with unruly oracles, and tucked in a corner like a shy animal, a small envelope with a stamp he didn't recognize. The stamp's ink had faded to a sepia sort of memory. It displayed an emblem of a sun half shaded by a ledger line. Beside the envelope lay a checklist, a thin, yellowing piece of paper titled in a precise, old-fashioned script, Armageddon Protocol 10-Step Checklist. There was a footnote attached in a different ink for use in case of complete protocol displacement only. Handle with ceremonial gloves. Norman read both items with the sort of attention he reserved for poems and for the copier's error logs. He smiled, a small inward smile that was more a twitch of professional curiosity than anything else. He lifted the envelope as if it were a sleeping thing and, without thinking, slid it into a drawer beneath his desk meant for miscellany, a drawer labeled miscellany, bits, tips, non-active property. He did so the way people sometimes place keys in pockets that are almost but not entirely intended for keys, out of habit and out of the need to be where things belong. He did not notice, at that precise moment, that the drawer had a crack in its corner and that the envelope's hem caught on the corner as it slid in. He did not notice that it did not fully rest in the drawer's soft darkness, but instead protruded a fraction, a small pale edge exposed to the departmental light. No one noticed, at that moment, anything beyond the usual, the kettle's resigned thunk, the soft bureaucratic humming of things that keep large things manageable. Norman went about his day arranging forms and composing marginalia, noting with the compulsive kindness of someone who had little theatre but many epistles that the copier still insisted on printing the word imminent, slightly askew. He marked his place with a pink sticky note and, for reasons he could not name at the time perhaps, because routine gives permission to small acts of grace, he wrote on it, "Do not let obsolete things outlive their purpose." Outside, the city went about its business with an untroubled vitality that would, in retrospect, seem terribly unaware of how dearly everything was scheduled, and inside, the department continued to administer endings as if they were tax returns, with the firm belief that accuracy produced comfort. Norman clicked his stapler once, then twice, then placed it back in the corner where it caught the light. An envelope sat, edge bare, in a drawer labeled miscellany. If fate were a machine, it would have been the sort of machine that traded in marginal margins and favored small slips. If fate were a clerk, it would have been precisely the sort of clerk who misplaced only the things that mattered. Norman did not know this yet. He went on with things it had always been his job to begin, and to continue, gently keeping the end of the world coralled in ink and procedure, while making, in the margins, room for the human things that did not fit so neatly into boxes. He arranged his sticky notes into a neat fan and read his poem, folded and familiar, before the kettle brightened the air with the tepid glow of a small, communal doggedness. The office hummed, a drawer held a misplaced envelope. Outside, the world continued to wear its normal face. It would not stay normal for long. On most mornings, the Department of Catastrophes emitted the kind of low, bureaucratic noise that could be measured as the universe sighing and be forgiven for it. There were the soft clicks of keyboards, each one a tiny verdict. The distant rattle of a filing cabinet, which in that particular corridor had been known to sound for 3 consecutive decades, without ever surrendering a drawer. And very importantly for Norman P. Ledger, the communal kettle which dutifully refused to produce anything hotter than a suggestive warmth. Norman's ritual was precise to the point of superstition. He arrived at precisely the same minute that the fluorescent lights decided to thrum with a tone only slightly off pitch from a tuning fork in need of retirement. He made a single cup of tea and then went to the teapot to allow it to stand and thus achieve its characteristic tepidness. He placed his hands around his tiny stapler, closing his fingers as if praying, and then he annotated. There were rules about annotation. Never underline without a secondary marginal note explaining why you underlined. Never use an exclamation point unless processing an existential hazard. If you made an emotional observation about a schedule, note whether it was optimistic, procedural, or likely to trigger an inspector's review. He was doing this now, with a particular appendix that had been appended to 3 different files over 2 different administrations and 1 minor solar flare. The paper smelled of the kind of toner that ages into the smell of a government building's collective self-respect, and the sticky notes radiated in different pastels, which made certain compliant people think they were being creative. "It's a nice trick," Clara Motes said from the neighboring desk, pushing a biscuit toward Norman like a tiny, flowery peace offering. "Write the marginalia. The margins appreciate it." Her eyes twinkled the way a person who kept emergency biscuits might. Norman smiled, which was the combination of a smile and a deep inward recalculation of the day's variable assumptions. He accepted the biscuit and used his free hand to relocate his spectacles, which had migrated down his nose in direct proportion to his concentration. Area Vost was a presence in the room like an immaculately ironed anti-corruption policy. She moved through memos with the kind of efficiency that left ink trails in the air. Her bun was as precise as a procedural subclause, and she carried, as ever, a red pen that she wielded not as a weapon, but as a talisman. Her face had what Norman privately called the ledger's gravity calm, severe, and astonishingly good at silence. "Ledger," she said, passing close enough that he could smell the faint perfume of formality. "Appendix D shall remain annotated. Yes, we cannot allow ambiguity, especially not in sections that describe fissures. Fissures are messy. Mess creates precedent. Precedent is slippery." Her voice, like the red pen, had a way of replacing words you might have intended to say with words that were better for everyone. Norman nodded because that was what nodded meant in that room. Assent, alignment, tiny heartbeat of compliance. Then he returned to his notes. If there was anything in the department that resembled a slack-jawed poet, it was not Norman, who preferred correct marginalia to metaphors, but the anxious office kettle and the janitor's old lullaby, which sometimes seemed to be 2 notes away from singing a truth. Mr. Enoch moved between floors with a mop that had the gravitas of a retired magistrate. He hummed like someone remembering the first drafts of the world. On Thursday mornings, because Thursday was the day the cosmic copier that printed out prophecies decided to take its weekly nap, visitors arrived by the door that read external inquiries. Today the visitor was Tom Chalk, who preferred to think of himself as an ex-celestial auditor, though most people in human resources were of the opinion that he was still a celestial at heart and merely taking a long, expressed leave. Tom pivoted into the office the way a well-placed comma pivots a sentence, with the suggestion that something more interesting than deadline extensions might exist. He had scuffed shoes, a tie that looked like it had survived a few good storms, and a smirk that understood profound things and preferred to make them slightly ridiculous. "Norman!" he called out, without shouting and therefore ensuring his voice would obey the department's noise ordinance. "How fares the land of margins?" He slung a shoulder into a spare chair as though it were a throne of minor irreverence. Norman looked up, as well as a man with 3 morning memos can expect, which is to say, mildly judged by the required readership. "And you?" He tried for Rye. Rye tended to look like a parable when practiced in that environment. Tom laughed. "Oh, audits. The usual does this prophecy meet the legislative emotionality clause of 1927. I answered with interpretive dance. I can't say it improved the metrics." He let the smirk settle into him like a cloak. Aria watched them for a moment and then, with the precision of someone who held authority, as one might hold a fragile document, she returned to her pile. There was a footnote about her that Norman could not place, an old rumor about a delayed apocalypse. He had once heard that Area Vost had stopped a small, very inconvenient dissolution 2 administrations ago by placing a single statement in the margin of a procedural memo. Whether the statement was a poem or a paragraph, or perhaps just a decisive comma, no one was entirely sure. She would never admit it, and the department would never record it. She treated exceptions the way people treated a dangerous spice, useful in tiny doses and always to be kept in the right jar. Gideon Furl, who preferred code to metaphor, and therefore often missed the point of both, appeared from behind a console with a printout under his arm. "I've dug into the log files," he said. "There are 3 odd entries in the queue management system at 0907. They look like someone testing the sorter with an obsolete discriminator. Curious, he had the look of someone who had discovered an unusual decimal. Obsolete discriminator. Tom purred the words as if they were a particularly delicious kind of biscuit. Clara leaned in, biscuit crumbs marking her enthusiasm. Obsolete or not, you can't say things like that. It's like whispering about dragons in a library. You'll either get a dragon or a police and dragons inspectorate. Either way, it's drama. And I like drama in small portions, preferably with tea." The kettle approved by making a kind of weak whistle, but said it was equally fond of small drama and cautious tea. At the heart of the department's daily hum was a stack of forms that might have been invented by someone who believed the world could be catalogued into perpetuity. There were forms for forms, forms to request new forms. Forms that asked whether previous forms had been filled out properly in the first place. The forms had a dignity only slightly less than the dignity of the people who filled them out. Norman loved forms the way some people loved a particular chair. He believed in their right angles, their logical closures, their insistence that one might be able to find a place for everything. But even Norman, who had, in the quiet hours, written sonnets to marginalia, could not help noticing that forms had a way of breeding footnotes, and that footnotes had a way of breeding clauses that could, on a tired afternoon, shift the world, which was to say it was lunchtime. The department's lunchroom was a place of negotiated domesticity. People ate sandwiches wrapped in procedural paper. There were notices on the wall about office fridge etiquette in 9 languages, and a small shrine of expired pastries that had been honored as a team-building exercise once, and then retired. Norman unwrapped his sandwich at his desk because he liked the envelope of quiet it provided. He had packed it with the kind of care one reserves for particularly argumentative memos, one slice of bread slightly braver than the other, filling a portion according to exactitude, a napkin folded to the width of a policy paper. He was mid-bite when Tom came over carrying a clipboard as though it were a guitar. "Have you missed the part where sandwiches are a form of protest?" Tom asked, watching the way Norman folded the napkin. "You fold toward the center, and then the center folds back at you. It's very symbolic." Norman, politely hungry, smiled and offered him half. "I folded it for preservation, not protest. But if it makes you less likely to comment on the annexations in Annex B, I will consider it a charitable act." Tom took the offered half and, for reasons of temperament more than hunger, balanced the sandwich on the corner of his clipboard. The clipboard had a history. It had supervised several appeals and a few small confessions. It held a pen clipped in a way that suggested it enjoyed holding power. Under its metal clasp, Tom had, more for amusement than necessity, affixed a little bag containing what looked like a tiny stamp collection. Norman could see only the edge of one of them, a hard-backed obsolescence of a sort departmental archivists like to keep wrapped and labeled incidental relics do not use. Clara sipped tea and watched the small tableau with the focused interest of someone who had memorized the department's various tragedies and amusements and preferred to keep them balanced. "Don't you dare," she said, though it was mostly an observation and only partly a plea. Tom grinned, nudged the clipboard. The sandwich slid, the clipboard tilted, and the little bag, like a beanbag thrown in a calm pool, took a hop and landed on Norman's open employee checklist. The checklist was old. It dated from when the department still used typewriter ink, and the phrase cosmic realignment was a fresh and oddly hopeful metaphor. Norman had been cross-referencing it for reasons that made sense in a chain of logic, only he seemed to hear. It belonged in a small pile for an audit that might arrive in the future, and a future audit would be only as worryable as its current neatness. The small bag had been sealed for decades and contained, among other things, an obsolete stamp. It was a bit of polymer the shade of an accountant's moral certainty, and it bore a design that suggested it had once been very important, perhaps in a way similar to a retired general being very good at giving speeches. The bag split open on impact. The stamp tumbled out and skittered across the page. It hit the checklist, made a tiny metallic clack, and settled over a box marked Sequence Validation Legacy Discriminator. It was, as Tom would have said, the sort of improbable punctuation that made stories. For Norman, the noise was the sort of punctuation that made the neck hairs stand up. People in the room registered in different ways. Clara hissed quietly, as if someone had suggested tea without biscuits. Gideon scrubbed a hand across his forehead. Aria, who had been a few feet away, her red pen hovering, as if it might draw the world into a better order, paused for a moment long enough to show the barest flicker of an old memory across her face, and then resumed, deciding to keep her calm the way one keeps a file in a drawer. Tom laughed, because of course he did. He found the universe's small slips instructive. Well, that's an interesting piece of old typing. He tapped the stamp with a finger, not thinking of consequences, more thinking of commentary. It's a relic. It should probably be reclassified as an archaeological find. Norman picked up the stamp, because what else would he do when a thing of the department landed on his desk? He rolled it between thumb and forefinger. It was unexpectedly cold and carried an odor like paper and rain. He glanced at the checklist and then, because habits are hard to unlearn, he made a marginal note, obsolete stamp contact, see footnoter. He did not mean the note to be performative. It was exactly the kind of accurate, mild observation the forms liked. Put it in the drawer with the other obsolete things, Clara suggested, because she liked the order of drawers and the way drawers made the world feel like something appointed. Yes, Norman heard himself say, I will. I'll file it under. He hesitated because the department's classification system ran so deep that one needed a small map and a permit to make a decision. Artifact obsolete in non-operational. Tom pocketed the clipboard and the rest of his quips. He tapped his tie with a conspiratorial expression. If the stamp starts reciting limericks, come see me. I like a good limerick. They all laughed in the way colleagues do when nothing crucial has yet broken. The kettle made a sound like a reluctant agreement. Norman, when no one was looking, placed the stamp in the top drawer of his desk. The drawer smelled of paper and the accumulated things of many people's days, old memos, a lost stapler pin, a blue pen without a matching cap, and, tucked in the far corner, a folded sheet of poetry he kept for when forms felt too much like cold metal. He told himself he was putting it safely away because that was the kind of sentence a conscientious clerk wrote to reassure themselves. He noted the time in his log, 12:13. He made the kind of marginal a clerk makes when nothing but compliance is required. Then he returned to his sandwich and to work. If the department taught anything across decades of tidy memos and the odd catastrophe, it was that small things did not always refuse their smallness. A coffee cup left on a ledger could change someone's mood. A misnumbered form could cost a committee its patience. Ink, once spilled, altered the hue of decisions. A comma moved could shift the trajectory of hearings. For now the stamp was inert. For now the kettle remained tepid. For now the jokes hung in the air like paper birds. But sometimes in offices and in oceans, a small thing's inertia had the oddest of afterlives. The day continued. Norman annotated. Gideon whispered something about log entropy. Aria issued a memo that read, in part, all fissures are to be treated as controlled variables. Tom hinted at a rumor about a friendly audit from the Celestial Division, and Clara supplied biscuits and an inordinate amount of cheer. Ma. Enoch hummed beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. Prophet Alice's voicemail kicked through to someone 3 desks away and made an odd, wind-rattled sound that everyone politely ignored because it was the professional thing to do. At 1418, a copier that had been grumbling since the 3rd administration performed an extraordinary act. It printed a single page of something that looked suspiciously like an old checklist. The paper fluttered to the floor, and someone with a sticky note saw it and left an extra box ticked in a place that had been left unticked since 1979. No one at the time paid that much notice. By the time Norman clocked out for the necessity of mild domesticity, the day had the taste of something that had been both well handled and badly understood. He gathered his tiny stapler, his annotated files, his folded poem, and in the back of his mind the stamp lay quiet in the top drawer like a small, patient idea. He did not know how could he, that in an underground sorter in a place that thought itself beyond accidentalities. The checklist had been scanned that afternoon by a machine that interpreted the stamp's contact as a sequence. He did not know that the machine, glad of a job after decades of quiet, dutifully recorded the anomalous contact in log files that thought themselves temporary and yet were used as precedent. He did not know that someone in a room of dull lacquered wood would later find an odd cluster of time-stamped entries and think them curious enough to forward. For Norman it was home. He walked past the teapot, which made that tired little whistle of domestic compliance, and he stepped into the corridor as the lights hummed their tired hymn. He hummed a line of a poem under his breath and thought of the top drawer and its small, inert occupant. And somewhere in the small, obedient ways of paperwork, the world blessed itself with a documentation that might, if left unchecked by certain improbable allies, decide that a small relic had once again become relevant. It was, by all measures of the department, still an ordinary day. That is to say it plainly exactly what made it the sort of day that could be dangerous. The kettle went cold, the lights kept humming. The stamp slept in its drawer with all the dignity of an unremarked thing. Norman went home with his sandwich half finished and a biscuit for the road. He did not yet know that the hairs on the back of reality's neck were beginning to stand up, a sensation that would be impossible to explain in a procedural footnote and therefore would be described later as a mildly alarming series of anomalies. He did not yet know, as he took the stairs and adjusted his spectacles, that somewhere a system that had not been asked to ask itself questions was about to begin asking them. For tomorrow, the department would have a couple of log entries to consider. There would be a flurry of internal emails that meant nothing in isolation and everything if read together. There would be a sandwich, a stamp, and a clipboard. There would be a kettle that continued to be tepid in the face of everything. But that was tomorrow. For now, Norman left a sticky note on his monitor, an admonition to himself about the margins, and turned off his light. The corridor swallowed the sound of his footsteps. The department kept its files. The world, as it tends to do, felt very slightly as if it were being rearranged by hands that believed they were only adjusting a paperweight. The last thing Norman heard as he exited onto the street where the sky practiced an inappropriate shade of afternoon was the faint, distant hum of Mir. Enoch's lullaby and the kettle's promise that it would be there tomorrow, tepid and loyal. He smiled not because he understood what might come, but because for a small, numbered moment the room had been steady, and his marginalia were in good order. And though nobody else noted it until later, when marginalia have the dangerous habit of becoming evidence, there was a tiny indentation in a checklist that suggested a contact had occurred at 12:13, a detail that would, in a very few days, be read with both curiosity and the procedural horror of someone finding an unaccounted comma in the ledger of fate. For the time being, the kettle, the biscuits, and the tape of office jokes rolled on. The Department of Catastrophes, famously, did its job. It collected small details and filed them away, trusting that if anything wanted to upset the order, it would at least consult a form first. Nobody had thought to ask the obsolete stamp for its opinions.